What does media literacy mean? Why do experts feel it's so important? And how do we know if we are media literate? I'm Michael Depp, editor of TV News Check, and this is Inside the Media, the show that looks at the business of the news and the people who make it. Today, we're going to take a close look at media literacy and what being media and news literate means in a highly fragmented landscape of news choices, fraught with subjectivity, politics, and bias. My guests this week are experts in news and media literacy and are going to help break down what it means, where and how to get it, and why they think it's vitally important that everyone do so for the health of society and democracy. Matthew Johnson is Director of Education at MediaSmarts, a nonprofit based in Ottawa that promotes digital and media literacy programs and resources with an emphasis on critical thinking skills. Alan Miller is the founder and outgoing CEO of the News Literacy Project, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit whose mission is to foster transparency in the news and to create resources and programs to develop media literacy. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Good to be with you, Michael.
So first things first, Matthew, what does media literacy mean?
Well, we consider digital media literacy, which we think of as a single concept, as the ability to critically, effectively, and responsibly access, use, understand, and engage with media of all kinds. And of course, that means both the traditional media that really were considered when we were originally developing media literacy, things like television, journalism, and so on, and interactive digital media, which are, of course, what young people use most often today.
And Alan, you put a bit of a finer point on it with your organization, the News Literacy Project. So what's the distinction when we talk about news literacy?
So we see news literacy as an effective and nonpartisan way of teaching media literacy. We are more narrowly focused on how to know what news and other information to trust, and instilling an appreciation of the role of the First Amendment and a free press in a democracy. We think ultimately we're really about giving people the tools to be equal, informed, and effective participants in the life of their communities and the country.
And of course, you say First Amendment because your organization is based in the United States. Matthew, let's get a bit of a historical perspective in terms of how media literacy came about as a discipline. Very briefly, what are its origins?
There were a number of different points of origin that all kind of converged around the same time. So we do see the beginnings of what was called film education in the UK. We do see early predecessors of media literacy education starting in the 1930s in the United States. And really in Canada, it was, of course, scholars like most famously Marshall McLuhan and also Harold Innis and people in that circle who really started to put the study of media on an organized basis that led to its invention as a subject that could be taught in school, really even starting from kindergarten up to grade 12 and beyond. And that was first done here in Ontario, the province in Canada where I live, which we believe to be the first jurisdiction, certainly the first English language jurisdiction to have media literacy in the official curriculum. And that came about as a result of a number of teachers who were in the same circle as McLuhan and Ennis, who started doing it locally at their schools in the 1970s. There was a push to bring it into the official curriculum, and in the 1980s, that did happen. Now in Canada, we have it represented in some way in every province and territory, and we're seeing that happening around the world as well, that in the past 2 decades, more and more countries, more and more states and provinces and so on have been bringing media literacy in various forms into their curriculum.
I should mention that we'll be talking about Marshall McLuhan a bit in the second part of this discussion, the next episode. So essentially, this came together, coalesced in schools as a discipline in the 80s and into the 90s, it seems. But things have lurched forward since then in the media landscape. The advent of media literacy came about in an era of one-way communication, but that's no longer the case, is it, Matthew?
Yeah, and that, of course, is the biggest change that has happened since media literacy was developed as a discipline and since it was brought into the curriculum, again, across Canada. And that is, of course, it used to be based on a media ecosystem where there were a small number of producers, an even smaller number of distributors of media, and doing both of those things was time-consuming and expensive. And as consumers, most of us were at the end of a distribution chain. There was very little that we could do to interact with the content that we were consuming. There was really not much more than we could do than to critically engage with it, which of course is still tremendously important. And also we were disconnected from one another in the audience. There were very few opportunities to interact with other audience members. And of course, all of that has changed. Today, we're not at the end of a chain anymore. We are all nodes in an infinite network. All of us are, to a certain extent, broadcasters and rebroadcasters. Whether or not we're sharing our own original content, we act as rebroadcasters. We amplify other signals by liking things, by sharing things, by responding to things, sometimes in ways we don't realize we're doing. And so it has become a much more complex environment. And of course, from an information point of view, the fact that it is now trivially easy and almost free to produce and distribute media has made a world of difference in terms of information, in terms of being able to tell whether the information that is coming to us is reliable, is coming from a reliable source, and has gone through some kind of process to try to determine that it is reliable.
So back in the day, in the pre-digital day, you could write a letter to the editor, you could call up your television or your radio station, but that was the extent of your ability to communicate. And that was not heard or seen by others. And of course, now with social media, that's what you're talking about, a fundamental change in the dynamics of media. So, I mean, stated positively, the digital age, and more specifically the social media age, has enabled everyone to be part of the media, and it's democratized the way that news and information can be and is disseminated. But with that democratization have come some very problematic byproducts. What are some of those byproducts, Alan?
So as Matthew has alluded to, I mean, we're in the most fraught information age in history. You know, we have more good and credible information available literally at our fingertips than any time before, but it's competing for our attention with far more information that is intended not to inform us in an accurate, dispassionate, fair-minded way, but to persuade, to sell, to inflame, to mislead. And there's no barrier to entry, whether for profit, ideology, or partisan purposes. And at the same time, we've seen a decline in news outlets with the implosion of the business model, particularly for newspapers in the United States. That's been precipitous. And so it's a real challenge. I mean, the consumer's in charge now of what they see and where they see and when they see, but most important, what they do with it, whether they trust it, whether they share it with others. And on top of which, we now know on the social media platforms that it's engagement through arrangement, and that it's the system is set up and the profit model to maximize posts that are inflammatory and extreme and highly partisan. And on top of that, we've seen, the Russian disinformation campaign in the 2016 election, disinformation from other foreign actors. So it's an incredibly challenging environment for the consumer to know, what news and other information to trust, share, and act on.
An environment in which people are ever more enclosed in filter bubbles that they've created for themselves too.
Well, that's the other thing. Of course, you've got the splintering of media. You've got the confirmation bias that people bring them to what they see themselves, and an inclination to look for only those sources they're prone to agree with. On top of that, the algorithms further inflame that division and heighten the polarization. And we've seen this play out certainly in the United States in a very significant way, in a perfect storm of conspiratorial thinking over the last couple of years around the pandemic, around the 2020 election. We're now seeing it with the war in Ukraine and with the rise of QAnon.
So, Alan, you see news literacy as the great challenge of our time. We can't even agree on basic facts anymore as a society. So how can we have effective policy debates or even civilized discussions? So how does news literacy directly connect to the health of democracy, public life, and even public health now with COVID?
Well, we see news literacy as a vital survival skill in this fraud information landscape. It's essential to be able to discern credible information, to be an effective and fully engaged participant, in the public life of the country. On top of which, now we know that mis and disinformation represent an existential threat to democracy. That facts are the basis for what we teach in our schools, for the basis of our effective scientific exploration and findings, and for our public policy debates, as you alluded to, Michael. And if we can't agree on them as a baseline, democracy is in trouble. And the entire marketplace of ideas really breaks down if we can't agree not only on what are the facts, but even on what a fact is.
The idea of bias is at the root of our problems around news literacy. Now, let's be really clear about what we're talking about when we talk about bias. Matthew, literally, what does it mean?
Well, fundamentally, what it means is presenting something in a positive or negative way, with a positive or a negative slant. But really, it is a lot more complicated than that, because where bias comes from is often not necessarily obvious to us. We have a tendency to think of media as being a window that lets us look at the world, particularly news or documentary, where that is the intent. But media, of course, really is more like a painting that was done by many hands. And every news story, as with every other media work, is influenced by all of the people who worked on it. It's influenced by the conscious choices they made, but it's also influenced by their own background, by their assumptions. And that's why it's really important to remember that it's the questions people don't ask. It's the assumptions they make. It's the decisions they don't realize they're making consciously that in many cases have a much bigger impact on the meaning or bias of a media work than anything that's happening consciously.
So all of the sort of manifestations of someone's subjective position.
Essentially, there's going to be always some influence from people's, again, their background, their assumptions, and their conscious choices. And of that, again, it's the product of many hands. It's pretty rare, except in a work with a single author like a novel. It's pretty rare for only one person to have a huge influence on the bias of a media work.
Michael, if I could jump in. Yeah, I wanted to just make a point to distinguish what we're talking about when we're talking about bias. So one of the things that we emphasize in our foundational lesson, our virtual classroom, is the distinction between news, opinion, advertising, propaganda, based on primary purpose. That's before you get to actually making things up with mis and disinformation. And I would say, there is an effort in standards-based quality news organizations, to the best of their ability, to minimize bias in the straight news coverage. And there's an editing process and a vetting process. There are multiple hands involved in the process to try to do that. It's an imperfect process by its nature, as Matthew points out. We all have biases we bring. But I spent 29 years as a journalist. I know that I did my best to set aside, to be cognizant of my biases and to set them aside, and to be fair, to have multiple points of view, to give people the information they need to make up their own mind in what I presented. And I think it's really important to distinguish between those kind of outlets where there is accountability, there is some transparency in sources and methods and where they're getting information. And then, opinion and propaganda and raw information and so on, where you don't necessarily, opinion, that there's a role for that, but obviously that there's a slant clearly, facts are built to make a case. But to make those distinctions, and then also to make the point about confirmation bias and what people bring. And I think there's a real tendency now to see our news through prisms of red and blue, and to dismiss things that we disagree with as biased, or as we maybe call them fake news, and to think that things that we tend to agree with, are more accurate or less biased. And that's become, an enormous factor in the selection process of what people are consuming, and also how they're viewing it.
I just want to make one note about structure too. And I hear what both of you are saying. Alan, what you're saying, of course, about process and about making sure you're being equivocal with the kinds of sources you go to, being aware of your own biases and trying to head those off when you're constructing a news story in as objective a way as possible. There's also, though, the structure of news. Like, for instance, a news website, you might see in the Washington Post in the US, for instance, the opinion columns are very highly placed on the page, and you're apt to, now, of course, they're marked as such, but you're apt to see those sources because they're wildly popular and some of the most read things on the site. You have to see those markers. In prime time on cable television, very often, which posits as news, those news cable networks, they run solely opinion in their primetime hours. And while we can intuit that their opinion, I'm just saying there's a possibility for conflation in the very structure in which the news is presented, which is something, which I suppose is part of media literacy one needs to be aware of.
If I can pick up on a couple of points here. So yes, I think it's imperative news organizations clearly distinguish between news and opinion, particularly since now so much of it's disaggregated. People are getting it through their social media feeds. I think it's particularly challenging when you look at the cable networks, because you've got a mix of news and opinion throughout the day, and opinion in the evening. You've also got individuals who are not even journalists. These are political professionals and partisans that are on panels with journalists, which makes it especially challenging. I would want to point out one thing, Michael, when you were talking about where corrections are placed and so on, let's distinguish. The key thing here is that reputable news organizations, as Matthew was saying, do correct factual errors. There is a way of doing that. Think about that against all of the other sources out there of news and other information that never correct anything. That's a good barometer for when people are looking for a credible source, looking at their reputation and looking to see if they have standards, their public standards, they have ethics standards, and do they have a correction policy and correct things? And do they also distinguish between news and opinion, in terms of delineating and marking and having a wall between news and opinion, or between news and business and advertising for that process. So, Michael, it is invariably imperfect. But it is a big distinction between having those standards-based and practices with ethics and some transparency and accountability, and so much else that doesn't have any of that.
Sure. So there is a lot, though, bottom line, for an average news consumer to have to wend through. So let's talk about how to deal with this. Matthew, your organization promotes something called Informational Triage. What does that mean?
Essentially, it's a way of trying to deal with the incredible surplus of information that we have today, because it's impossible to fact check single thing that you see online. It would be exhausting. And to a certain extent, that exhaustion is what people who spread disinformation want to produce. They want to tire you out. They want to make you feel like it's impossible to tell the difference between reliable and unreliable sources. So that's why it's a mistake to apply what we would call traditional media literacy approaches to something before you're sure it's worth your time. Informational triage is determining, first of all, whether something is worth your critical attention. So you follow a small number of quick and easy steps. We have 4 steps that we teach in our Break the Fake campaign. Using fact-checking tools, finding the original source of a story, verifying that source, and checking the story against other sources that you know are reliable. Once you've learned these, each of these is likely going to take you no more than 30 seconds, maybe a minute, Most of the time, just one or maybe two of these will be enough. And that's how you find out whether something is from a source that is worth your attention. If it's not, then you just ignore it. You need to find evidence that something is worth paying attention to. Once you've gotten to that stage, then you can apply the more traditional media literacy, the close reading of a text that is something we can do once we realize something is worth giving it deeper attention.
And just very, very briefly, what are sort of the hallmarks of that close reading?
Well, those go back to looking at things like bias. So looking at how things are presented, looking at the implication of the headline, what things were picked out from the story into the headline. If there are photos or graphs, what was chosen, how do they influence our reading of it, whose voices were included. So if it's about a particular community, were people from that community quoted? You can compare it, and that's one of the great things about the internet, is that it's very easy to read 4 or 5 articles on the same topic. You can compare it to articles from other sources on the same topic to see what was included and what was left out. Those more complex, close reading strategies are really how you get an idea of the work that was, the decisions that were made in putting it together. They let you critically engage with a story that is worth critically engaging with.
Alan, your organization promotes an approach called Checkology. Can you explain briefly what that means and how people can put it into practice?
Sure, Michael. Checkology is actually our virtual classroom, and it's a cutting-edge, highly engaging online platform with real-world lessons led by a diverse and dynamic group of journalists and experts on the First Amendment in digital media. And basically, we have a version for students, which is being used in every state in the US and also in Canada and many countries around the world, and a version for the general public as well. And it gives people a grounding in how to know what news and information to trust. I mean, there are lessons on the difference between news, opinion, advertising, propaganda based on primary purpose, on focusing on misinformation, on conspiratorial thinking, on the watchdog role of the press. There's a lot of opportunity for learning by doing through engagement. And this, we've seen this, we know this with our work in schools throughout the country. It gives people a grounding in how to discern quality news and information, and appreciation of the First Amendment in the US, understanding the watchdog role of journalism, and an appreciation of the standards of quality journalism that people can apply as an aspirational yardstick to any piece of news or information they encounter.
Matthew, your group fundamentally emphasizes that media are constructions. News stories are made things. So given that, how should a media literate person apply that to their encounter with a news story?
Well, again, it is about recognizing that the news article that comes before you is the product of choices that were made by many different people. And those people were professionals. Those people were almost always people working in good faith, trying to do their best to get you accurate news, to minimize bias. But at the same time, they are people who made choices about what to include, what to leave out. There were other things that they maybe were not free about. You don't necessarily have an endless amount of time or space for a story. You don't necessarily have an endless amount of time to cover a story. Journalists are under time constraints. But understanding that what you're seeing was built by people who made choices, who made assumptions. And so as a result, we need to think about the choices and assumptions and the time pressures and other factors that influenced it. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that the more people know about how the news industry actually works, the better they are at recognizing reliable news sources, because they come to understand the actual ways that errors or bias can creep into a story. And they come to realize that it is very rarely about a partisan bias, but rather about simply the points of view and the experiences and the assumptions of the people who made the news.
As we've been saying, Alan, you and Matthew both work in organizations that are largely targeted to students. When is it best for a person to start getting educated on media literacy? When do you have the most impact before filter bubbles of any kind start to set in?
Well, when we made a decision at the outset, when I founded the News Literacy Project and helped found the field in 2008, that we were going to focus on middle school and high school students, the reason was to reach them when they were forming habits of mind and consumption habits that would last a lifetime. And this was before anybody talked about filter bubbles, or we weren't as hyper partisan as we are now. But it's important to get them before they start to develop those habits of looking only for sources that would confirm their points of view, would get a broader news diet. And also before they, frankly, are drawn into rabbit holes of conspiratorial thinking. And we're now working with the general public as well. And obviously, it's much more difficult. Not only are they not in school where you can reach them there, but there are a lot of people who don't believe they need this critical thinking skill because they're going to believe what they choose to believe. And in many cases, not all, but they may be led much more by their emotions than by their intellect about what they're trusting, and then get deeply invested in that.
So for those people who are beyond high school and who are watching this and thinking, I want to try to shore up my own media literacy, what are, from both of you, what are some of the best resources to which they can turn?
So in my case, I would steer them to us at newslit.org. We have, I mentioned the virtual classroom. We have a weekly newsletter called Get Smart About News that takes the most recent conspiracy theories, viral rumors, and hoaxes and debunks them. We have a podcast called Is That a Fact? And an app called Informable, which is a game that builds and assesses all news literacy skills. And so, for everyone on our site is a place people can go for those resources, all of which, by the way, are available at no cost.
Matthew?
So our Break the Fake program, which is available to anyone around the world at breakthefake.ca, was actually designed for general audiences. It does have lessons for the classroom that go along with it, but it was designed for people of any age. And as I mentioned, it teaches those 4 basic steps for determining whether or not something is worth your time, worth your attention, finding out whether it is true or unreliable. And we have a number of videos that go along with that as well, and other materials. And just like the News Literacy Project, all of our resources are available free from our website, either at breakthefake.ca or all of our other resources at MediaSmarts.ca.
Great. And we'll have all those on the screen as well. So this is such an enormous, important subject that we're going to continue this discussion in our next episode when I talk with 2 media literacy educators about how exactly it works inside schools and draws on developmental psychology. Until then, thanks to Matthew Johnson and Alan Miller for being here. Thank you both.
Thank you, Michael.
You can watch past episodes of Inside the Media on YouTube and Facebook. Thanks to all of you for watching, and see you next time.